Welcome back. All right, it's been a few days. Okay, so for those of you just joining in, or those of you watching this on playback, I'm reading The Quarantine at Alexander Abraham's. It is based on the show Road to Avonlea. Road to Avonlea, a spinoff of Anne of Green Gables, which was based on Lucy Maud Montgomery's books. Anyway, oh, you hear my dog in the background? Anyway, I started doing these streams, but then the writer's strike and the SAG-AFTRA strike hit. And because Road to Avonlea was a co-production from Canada and the United States, I had to stop. But now that it's over, like, I know it's been 2 years, but, I had to move and everything. Anyway, I'm rereading this. I decided to start this over from the beginning, and now I'm on chapter 3. So if you want to see me read the first 2 chapters, just go back to the playback in my channel, and you'll be able to see it. Anyway, here I go. Chapter 3. Oh my gosh, my nose itches. Sorry. Okay. Chapter 3. At almost exactly the same time as Rachel Lynde was preparing to beard Mr. Abraham in his den, Sara and her 3 King cousins were setting out for the same Mr. Abraham's barn. Sara was staying at the King farm while Aunt Hetty and Aunt Olivia were going on a trip to Charlottetown. It had taken Felix some time and much argument before the others had agreed to accompany him on his mission to warn Jimmy Spencer that Rachel Lynde was after him. Felicity had been quite decided about not going. I really can't see why you're making such a fuss over a hired hand, she had said dismissively when Felix suggested the idea. Don't you see, I owe Jimmy a favor, Felix had retorted. He stood in for me that time I went trouting in the brook instead of going to Sunday school. You mean you skipped Sunday school, Felix? 10-year-old Cecily's eyes were 2 round saucers in her round little face. Sure I did, but don't you breathe a word of it to Mother or Father. Really, Felix, you seem to think skipping Sunday school makes you some kind of daredevil, sniffed Felicity, who was behaving exactly like someone who had climbed out of the wrong side of the bed that morning. At first, Cecily had also refused to go because of old Mr. Abraham's reputation around Avonlea as a mean old man. I'd be much too scared of bumping into him, she had whispered, as though Mr. Abraham were God or the devil. I'll only go if Felicity holds my hand the whole time. Needless to say, the idea of encountering the reclusive Mr. Abraham seemed to Sara the most interesting aspect of the enterprise. She had never failed to be intrigued by the variety and vagaries of human nature. Okay, seriously, what is with all these big words? Anyway, finally, they reached a consensus. They would go because Felix felt horror-bound to find Jimmy. But they would not remain long on the premises. They would seek out Jimmy Spencer, warn him of Mrs. Lynde's imminent visitation, and leave. Felicity grudgingly agreed to hold Cecily's hand throughout the entire trip, but she gave in with such bad grace that a pall had settled over the excursion before they had taken their first step. Felicity's temper did not improve as the day wore on. Truth to tell, her bad mood was one that the family had grown used to of late, ever since Sara first arrived. As the eldest and most striking of the 3 King children, Felicity was accustomed to attracting attention and admiration wherever she went. Tall for 13, with a pink and white complexion, she wore her long, thick chestnut hair streaming down her back. Already an accomplished seamstress, she had developed a reputation amongst the girls of Avonlea as their resident expert on fashion and household arts. To her, they flocked for advice about which gloves to wear to a wedding, the best method of getting dough to rise, and the neatest way to turn asleep. In short, Felicity was accustomed to such limelight as Avonlea had to offer, and she had no desire to share it. Yet, with Sarah's arrival on the island, Felicity felt her monopoly threatened. Not that Sara was prettier than Felicity, Sara could not boast Felicity's conventional good looks. Small for her 12 years, with a pointed white face in which the eyes seemed almost too large, and a tumble of pale hair, there was something elfin, almost otherworldly about Sara. Her face reflected a vivid inward life. One could not look at Sara and call her beautiful, as one might describe Felicity. Yet, one could not look once at Sara's face and ever forget it. Sara Stanley had grown up in Montreal, the imaginative only daughter of a wealthy financier. Her mother had died when Sara was a little more than a baby. When her father's business collapsed amidst rumors of financial scandal, Sara had been sent to Prince Edward Island to live with her mother's family, the Kings of Avonlea. Unlike Felicity, Sara had never in her whole life baked bread or sewn a seam, nor had she ever devoured the Family Guide from cover to cover, as Felicity did regularly. The Family Guide, a manual of manners useful in all matters domestic and worldly, was Felicity's secular Bible. She had committed whole sections from pages to memory. Sara, on the other hand, found it difficult to commit anything to memory except poetry. But if Sara had arrived in Avonlea untutored in the domestic arts, she brought with her an array of other skills, which up to then had been unknown and thus unvalued by Felicity. For one thing, Sara could tell a fine story. Now, this may not, at first glance, seem any great gift, but to hear Sara tell a story was to be transported back into the days of old when the whole of civilization depended on it for entertainment, on the spoken word. When Sara told a tale, princesses and princes, goblins and trolls appeared before the children's eyes, as though summoned by magic. Her voice became their voices, the voices of ancient royalty, of nymphs and dryads, specters and spirits. She made their sorrows and loves, their actions and gestures her own. And although her stories told of creatures from distant lands and times, they seemed familiar to the children, as though they recognized dimly something of themselves in the tales. Sara made imagination take wing in a way Felicity had never known possible. It was this gift that had earned her the name the Story Girl. Sara had another gift, one which the fashion-conscious Felicity resented even more. It was this which was on Felicity's mind now as she strode grumpily through the grass towards Alexander Abraham's farm. She was still smarting from her experience in church the day before. What happened was this. On Saturday, Felicity had devoted most of her day retrimming her best Sunday hat. From the peddler who appeared in Avonlea from time to time, she had bought a splendid piece of broad velvet ribbon. All her precious egg money had gone to that ribbon, which was the deepest midnight blue. With her mother's help, she removed the slightly faded turquoise cotton band from the crown of the hat and replaced it with the velvet. Then, using the daintiest of stitching, she sewed two narrower pale blue ribbons into the velvet, outlining it top and bottom. These ribbons were longer. They tied into a bow at the back and fell in a graceful slope on Felicity's hair. After she had finished pushing her reluctant needle through the tough straw, Felicity's poor fingers were bruised and punctured. eye strain had caused a tiny network of red veins to appear in her left eye, and her back ached from bending over her work. Yet she felt buoyed up by the knowledge that she had accomplished what she set out to do. In her place of worn, faded old hat, she now had one that looked gloriously new. When she thought of the effect it would have in church the next day, all her fatigue dissipated and she positively glowed. And indeed, that Sunday morning, as she entered church, Felicity felt like a queen wearing her crown for the first time. With downcast eyes, she entered the King family pew, expecting to hear murmurs of approval from the girls in the surrounding pews. When not one single subdued compliment reached her ears, she raised her eyes and saw at once the reason for the silence. Sara was walking down the nave wearing a simple white and yellow dress. She wore no hat. Instead, she had pinned 2 or 3 daisies in her fair hair. The morning sun spilled through the colored windows and onto Sara, so that she seemed to drift in a stream of light. The white gold hair, the white and yellow daisies, the pale skin, the honey-colored dress all seemed to blend into one natural shimmering whole. Dragging her eyes away, Felicity glanced at her friends and schoolmates. Without exception, they were all staring at Sara. They looked bewildered, bedazzled. And the worst thing about it, Felicity thought, wanting to burst into tears, was that it all looked so effortless. She knew Sara had no idea of the effect her entrance had caused. She had not planned it. She was simply being Sara, a Sara who sometimes aroused in her elder cousin a resentment amounting to fury. As the memory of Sara's I can't read for some reason. As the memory of yesterday's humiliation returned, Felicity glared at Sara, who ambled, all unknowing, ahead of her dreamily picking buttercups. Everyone at church yesterday thought you looked mighty foolish, Sara Stanley, she burst out. You looked like you were showing off. Felix looked over at his sister. He was 2 years younger than Felicity, but he could, on occasion, be alarmingly perceptive about her feelings. You're just jealous because no one noticed your fancy hat, he remarked. Sara turned. I noticed it. After church, when you were standing by Aunt Janet, I thought the blue velvet set off your eyes quite wonderfully. You made me think of... Okay, forgive me if I mispronounce it. Lapis lazuli and faraway seas. Now Felicity, of all people, knew a compliment when she heard one. She might have had no idea that lapis lazuli was a prize gem of brightest blue. Nor did faraway seas sound as entrancing to her as they did to Sara. But the general tone of the remark was flattering, she could tell. Even such generous words, however, failed to smooth her ruffled vanity. The truth was that Felicity had worked herself into such a lather of rage that it would take more than words to rinse her clean. The venom in her response was startling, even to her. Well, I thought you looked perfectly ridiculous, Sara. Flowers in your hair in church. What will you think of next? I don't see why it should be all right to wear flowers on your dress and not in your hair, objected Sara, pointing to the floral pattern on Felicity's pinafore. Oh, you don't you? Well, in that case, I dare you to wear that old funeral wreath on your hair. Tucked away in a corner of a field they were passing stood a small family graveyard, most of its headstones weathered and crumbling. Had it not been for the small wreath propped up against one of the more erect gravestones, a casual observer might have been forgiven for thinking the whole place looked abandoned. It was at this wreath that Felicity now pointed. Sara stared at her in disbelief. Felicity surely couldn't expect her to steal someone else's funeral wreath, but this and nothing less was clearly what Felicity did expect. Go on, I dare you. Stick those flowers on your head. Sara took a step forward. Cecily pulled her back. Don't do it, Sara. You mustn't ask her to, Felicity. The wreath was made of once sweet-smelling grasses intertwined with small dried flowers, rosebuds and marigolds, daisies and bachelor's buttons. Sara had no idea how long it had lain there in the quiet field. Someone had lovingly picked those flowers and woven them into the circle of remembrance, someone who wanted to honor a departed loved one. How could she possibly take it away? See, it's all talk with you, Sara Stanley. You'd no more wear this filthy old flowers on your head than you'd wear a chamber pot. That was too much for Sara. The flowers may have been dry and a little dusty, but they were not filthy. They were a token of real affection. She was not going to let Felicity insult them. Stooping, she bent her head close to the tomb. Don't worry, I'll return them, she whispered to the silent stone. In one swift, graceful motion, she picked up the wreath and placed it on her head. Then she walked proudly back to her cousins. The wreath, with its faded daisies and russet leaves, framed her elfin face. Around her neck hung a glowing yellow chain of buttercups woven as she had picked them along the way. Instead of looking out of place and silly, as Felicity had hoped, she seemed in harmony with the quiet place. She looked, thought Felicity, furiously as though she were a spirit of the meadows. All right, chapter 4. Excuse me. All right. Felix turned and walked impatiently away from the graveyard. He had about enough of his elder sister's bad mood. We've got to hurry, Felicity. If I don't warn Jimmy, Rachel Lynde will catch him. And then the fat'll be in the fire. Why, he might even get a hiding from old man Abraham. Hiding, that means spanking. Okay. In less than 5 minutes, the children reached the Abraham farm. As soon as they laid eyes on the house, they could tell it belonged to someone with a reputation for crustiness. Neglect was written all over it. Weeds grew up to the very door. The woodwork cried out thirstily for a lick of paint. What blinds remained hung crooked and torn. The windows wore a thick curtain of dust. Felicity eyed it with distaste. It's plain to see there's no woman around that place, she sniffed. Yeah, but take a look at the barn. That's a mighty nice barn, replied Felix, who had inherited the King talent for farming. Sara gave no thought to the barn. The sight of the house with its blank windows had aroused her in an almost forgotten memory. Okay, I really wish they would stop saying aroused, because that does not mean what it used to mean. Okay. All right. As a small child, she had once journeyed on her own from Quebec City to Montreal by train. She remembered sitting alone in the carriage while night fell. As the train creaked slowly through the outskirts of the city, she had been able to gaze from her carriage into the grimy windows of the houses huddled close to the tracks. She had seen there life she had never experienced before. Families sitting around in their evening meal, mothers reading to their children, or simply holding them onto their laps. To the lonely child, each window seemed to offer a glimpse into a crowded family life she had never known. The vision was enhanced by the warm, amber-tinged glow from the lamp that lit each room. At one window, Sara had seen mother seen a mother reaching up to close the curtain. Behind her, a man moved, a child in each arm, another on his back. They were dressed for bed. The man was twirling them around, plunging and rearing as though he were a horse, while the children laughed and shrieked with delight. Then the woman pulled the curtain shut. The sight had stayed in Sara's mind long afterwards. If she had been able to paint, she would have painted that scene of a happy family glimpsed from the outer dark. The darkness of Mr. Abraham's windows reminded her of that scene and of her own feelings of loneliness. She felt a surge of sympathy for the old bachelor, whom everyone seemed to fear. Okay. His house looks so sad, don't you think? She whispered, with its windows so bare and bleak. Reminds me of something dead with its eyes picked out, replied Felix, who had enough discussion for one day. Now come on, I've got to look in the barn. I'll bet that's where Jimmy is. But Jimmy Spencer was not to be found in the barn, nor could they run him to the ground in any of the small sheds grouped nearby. Puzzled, the children made their way back towards the house. Maybe Rachel Lynde's already been here, worried Felix. Maybe she's dragged him back to town and locked him in the church just so he won't miss next Sunday. Does that mean we can go home now? Piped up Cecily, who had been remarkably silent for some time in mortal fear of mortal fear that Mr. Alexander Abraham might appear at any moment in a puff of smoke. Please, let's go home. I'm awfully scared of him. I don't think you need to be afraid of him, Cecily, said Sara. He's probably not nearly as frightened as people say, or as frightening as people say. In fact, I think he sounds quite interesting. I'd rather like to meet him. Felicity rolled her eyes heavenward. You think you can make friends with just about anyone, don't you, Sara Stanley? Felicity rolled her eyes heavenward. Oh, wait, I just read that. Oh, my God. Okay. Not with old man Abraham, you can't, commented Felix. Everyone says he hates women. Well, I'm not a woman yet, answered Sara with irrefutable logic. So even if it's true that he hates women, he'd probably have no reason to hate me. Very well then, Felicity's ability to put up with Sarah's irritating self-confidence a moment longer had come to an abrupt end. Go and make friends with him. Go on, I dare you. Just march right up to that front door and knock. Go on. Sara did not hesitate. Knocking on someone's door seemed a trifling matter compared to robbing a grave of its funeral wreath. Without a word, she jumped onto the front porch and strode to the door. Lifting the tarnished brass knocker, she let it fall heavy back into place. All this was accomplished so quickly that the others scarcely had the time to realize what she was doing. As the loud knocking reverberated through the house, they scattered wildly, looking for places to hide. Just as Sara was lifting the knocker a second time, a large dog bounded around the corner of the front porch and headed straight towards her. Sara stared at him curiously, waiting for him to bark. But for some reason, the dog remained silent. It ran noisily in her direction, its purpose and attitude a mystery. Just keep calm, hissed Felix from his hiding place in the bushes to one side of the porch. Don't let him see you're frightened. I'm not frightened, Sara replied calmly. I can make friends with anyone, human or animal. Stretching out her arm, she attempted to stroke the dog's brown head. The dog jerked away and looked up at her quickly. Then, as though something about her had convinced him she meant well. He bowed his head and submitted to her hand. Again, Sarah's confidence set Felicity's teeth on the edge. I dare you to go into the house, she called. Anyone can see there's no one at home. I can't go into someone's house, Felicity. You're being silly. With her arm around the dog, who by now was wagging his tail, Sarah descended the porch steps. I am not being silly, Felicity stammered, her foot, her eyes blazing. All you have to do is go inside, count to 10, and come back out. There's nothing to it. I dare you, Sarah. Sarah sighed. Felicity seemed to be behaving in such an odd fashion this morning. She glanced over at Cecily. The 10-year-old stood rigidly beside her elder sister, her face pale, her thumb jammed into her mouth. Cecily had almost grown out of the habit of sucking her thumb. Sarah knew that she only reverted to this childish practice when she was well and truly terrified. Perhaps she should indulge Felicity's whim. After all, the sooner she did, the sooner Felicity would be satisfied. Then they could all go home and let poor Cecily recover her wits. All right, I'll do it. I'll go inside. This time, as she approached the dirty door, she trod on a rotten floorboard. It gave way with a sudden crack. For a moment, her foot dangled in the nothingness that lurks under every porch. Trying not to panic, she held onto the door and jerked her foot upwards and out. A huge sigh of relief escaped her lips. Briefly, she had been unable to suppress images of spiders and hungry bats nibbling at her imprisoned foot. Moving more cautiously now, she turned the handle, but the door, swollen with damp or age, was either locked or stuck. It refused to budge. I can't get in, she called back. The door seems to be locked. Try a window then. Felicity was implicable? I don't know. There's an open one on this side of the house. Sarah was about to protest when she remembered Cecily's stricken face. Doing her best to avoid any further encounters on the rotten floorboards, she ran lightly along the front porch, down the steps, and over to the spot where Felicity stood. A large, low-branching plum tree leaned towards one side of the house. Looking up, Sarah could see an open window on the second floor. What seemed to her inexpert eye a tolerably strong branch reached towards the window, almost touching. Go on, I dare you. Felicity's cheeks were flushed. Sarah wondered whether she were ill. I'm not going to argue with you, Felicity, but I think you're being extremely silly. Felicity's response was to stick out her tongue. With a sigh of exasperation, Sarah began to climb a tree. Okay. All right, that was chapter 4. All right, chapter 5. If Sarah had looked down towards the lane as she climbed, she might have spied Mrs. Lynde advancing briskly towards Mr. Abraham's house. But Sarah was too taken with the verdant beauty around her to look down and at the pedestrian earth. Above her, she could see an azure sky framed by a fringe of leaves. Through a sweet-smelling branch to her left, she caught a glimpse of the brighter blue of the sea. It sparkled as it danced, seeming to beckon her invitingly. All her worries about Cecily's fear and Felicity's strange mood seeped out her soul as a great surge of delight in the wonder of the world swept in. It's so beautiful up here, she sighed to herself, a sympathy in greens and blues. Below her, Felix almost danced with impatience. Would you just stop goggling and get inside, he implored. Old man Abraham might come back at any moment. Hardly were the words out of his mouth when the dog raised its brown head and cocked its ears. uttering a low growl as it disappeared round the corner towards the front of the house. The children stiffened in fear. "Now we're in for it," whispered Felicity. "He's back, and he's gonna go raving mad when he sees us." Around the corner, out of sight, the dog could be heard barking furiously. "If it's Mr. Abraham who's back, then why would his dog bark?" wondered Felicity. As they stared at each other in terror, unsure whether to run or stay, and an unmistakable voice assaulted their ears. Get down, you loathsome creature," it roared. Fearful bangings and rappings shook the side of the house. The side of the porch. The children clutched each other in shock. "It's Mrs. Lynde," croaked Felicity. "It's Rachel Lynde," hissed Felix up the tree to where Sara crouched precariously on a branch. "Get down this minute, Sara. If she catches us here, we'll never hear the last of it." Whoever claimed that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't had obviously never met Rachel Lynde. As far as the children were concerned, they would rather have been trapped by an unknown Mr. Abraham than encounter the all too familiar wrath of Mrs. Lynde. The one exception to this rule was Cecily, who was too young to have ever experienced the rough side of Rachel's tongue. Poor Cecily had heard so much whispered talk about the fearsome Mr. Abraham that he loomed in her imagination like a cross between the ghost of Christmas past and the devil incarnate. Could anybody even Rachel Lynde possibly be worse than him? Her whole body shook with terror as she squeezed her elder sister's hand. "What should we do, Felicity?" she gasped. "Do? Why, we have to run. Get down, Sara, for heaven's sake." "I'm coming as fast as I can." Oh no!" In the edging towards the trunk, from one of the outer branches, Sara had caught the back of her pinafore on a jutting limb. Try as she might, she could not budge it. "Please, Felix, climb up and help me," she implored. "All right, I'm coming. Fear lent unaccustomed swiftness to Felix's ascent. "Gosh, Sara," he puffed as he climbed. "I hope you'll think twice the next time before you accept one of Felicity's silly dares." The same thought had occurred to Sara, who did not reply. Her earlier exhilaration had vanished, replaced by a growing feeling of dread. The wind had risen. Under its uneven pressure, the branches rocked back and forth. Leaves rattled harshly all around her, blotting out sight and sea. Her stomach churned in rhythm with the motion of the tree. Although she was relieved to see Felix approaching closer, she feared his added weight might place too much strain on the branch where she was caught. "I don't think you should," she began, but it was too late. With a loud cracking sound, the long branch snapped in half, propelling both Sara and Felicity onto the small balcony underneath Mr. Abraham's second floor window. One moment they were clinging to the branch for dear life, the next they were being flung onto the balcony as though by an enormous fist. Sara had fallen close by the window. Hearing a moan, she picked herself up and raced over to Felix, who had landed half on, half off the balcony. His hands and arms clutched frantically at the shaking wood, while his feet kicked out into space. Grabbing his arms, Sara managed to heave him over the side where he lay on the floor, his eyes still closed in dread, his face working. "It's all right, Felix. You're safe now," whispered Sara. She crouched down beside him, patting his head consolingly. "You can open your eyes and stand up." As they clambered to their feet and looked cautiously over the rail, both children gasped in dismay, for there far below them on the ground, broken and useless In a heap of scattered leaves and broken twigs lay the former means of escape. No longer could they climb down by way of Plumtree. They were trapped on Mr. Abraham's balcony. Now they had no choice but to sneak inside his house. All right, that was chapters 3 through 5. I will do the next few chapters, and if not tomorrow, the next few days. Thank you.